Hello class, today we are going to start talking about the intro to metabolism. So the goals and objectives for this lecture is going to be to explain the metabolic pathways, define energy in terms of kinetic and potential, discuss free energy, which is what's released during a exergonic reaction or goes into an endergonic reaction. We're going to discuss entropy, explain the first and second laws of thermodynamics. There are three, but we're only going to be discussing two in this lecture. And we're going to talk about ATP hydrolysis and regulation. So first, let's go ahead and start talking about energy in the world of life. So energy in life comes from the sun. Okay, the sun releases light energy on producers. Okay, the energy is going to flow through the producers, and then finally, through chemical reactions, it's going to get to the consumers, which would be heterotrophs, just like you and me. Energy gets transferred many times throughout this course. Okay, so here's the sun's energy getting transformed through those photons coming down in light energy to those producers, which would be our aka autotrophs or our plants. The plants undergo photosynthesis, release that glucose molecule as energy for consumers. Then consumers waste products such as our own. If we're talking about cellular respiration, we release carbon dioxide, which gets reversed back into the producers as well. All of life on the earth is already disposed of. It's already there. It's just a matter of energy being cycled through different producers, consumers, and decomposers back and forth. And all of it is already permanently dispersed. Okay. However, with each energy transfer, there is an escape of energy. So in other words, that's kind of like when you're heating up a pot of water on the stove. Okay, you're actually heating up the water that's there, but some of that is actually getting lost in a form of gas. Okay, that's why you see that steam coming off. That's pretty much what they're talking about. It's escaping as heat energy. Okay. So, what is the term they use to, when they're talking about energy being, flowing through one form to another? It's actually bioenergetics. Okay, it's a term used to describe the concept of energy flow through living systems such as cells. Right here would be a really good bioenergetic flow to follow, so you can see the transfer of energy from one form to the other. We have the light energy from the sun coming on to the producers. The producers are releasing, like we said, the glucose molecule, and then this primary consumer eats the grass. Then that primary consumer gets eaten by the secondary consumer, and it goes on and on. But each time that energy is transferred from one form to another, and like I said, a little bit always gets lost as heat energy. So we're going to be talking about what is metabolism first of all, okay? It's the cellular processes such as the building or breaking down of molecules that occur through the chemical reactions. Number one, they can occur spontaneously and release energy and require energy to proceed. It just depends on which metabolic pathway you're talking about, okay? Metabolism, the actual definition would be all the chemical reactions that occur inside of your cells that consume or generate energy. So if you have a fast metabolism, these chemical reactions are happening at a much quicker rate than it would be for, let's say, somebody else that you're comparing yourself to. Okay. Now, when we eat, we need to break down our food. Okay. So when we eat, we are actually performing a catabolic reaction. It's when larger molecules are broken down into smaller ones. Okay. So as you guys can see, these are actually a larger molecule, and it's actually joined together with bonds. But during a catabolic reaction, it gets broken down into individual monomers here. Okay. Opposite though is for anabolic. Okay. Anabolic, you have smaller molecules individually. They're not bonded together. You have to put an input of energy here. You're actually going to add energy to this, and then you can go ahead and combine them into a much larger molecule. So I like to memorize these two as anabolic. I think of anabolic steroids. Okay, it's going to build those muscles up for those big guys. Okay, so they're starting off with separated, let's say, individual monomers, and then they take anabolic steroids to make a big, huge muscle, and this would be the energy they have to input at the gym. Catabolic, I think of as cats. So cats have those long, sharp nails. They like to tear things apart. So when a cat comes around this huge molecule right here, it's going to tear it apart and then make these individual smaller molecules, and it actually releases energy. Okay. So let's go ahead and review what each of them are again. Remember, catabolism, I think of cats. They're going to release energy when they break those complex molecules into simpler compounds. Anabolism, I think of anabolic steroids. Okay, they're going to consume energy. It has to have energy, and their purpose is to build up more complex molecules from those simple ones. So what is the definition of energy? Energy is the capacity to actually do work. So one form of energy can be converted to another, and it exists in many different forms. We've already talked about a couple. We've talked about the light energy from the sun, heat energy, electricity, and motion. So motion. If you all have taken physics before, you've heard these two types of energy before. There's kinetic energy, which is the energy of motion. So if something's in movement, that means it has kinetic energy. Okay, so for example, in this picture right here, there is no kinetic energy from the water because nothing's in movement yet. But there's movement over here on this side, down this kind of river coming down. There's actually a nice waterfall at the end, but the purpose of saying this is that water is in movement, so that's where you're going to get the kinetic energy from right here. Now, potential energy is energy of location or structure. So it's kind of stored energy. When you're talking about chemical bonds, it's energy that can be stored, but when it's broken apart, it gets released. So potential energy on this picture to the left would be the water behind a dam. It has stored energy because if that dam was opened up, it has a potential to do a great amount of work. But for right now, it's in a stored location, so that's why it's known as a potential energy. Another good example that I like to think of when I think of potential energy is a ping pong machine. You know that part where you actually pull back the launcher before the ball goes out? Potential energy would be as if you pulled this spring all the way back and just held it there. It's potential energy because it's stored energy that has the capacity to do work. Because if you release that lever right here, that ball is going to go flying due to the energy that's been built up in the spring. So now we're going to go ahead and start talking about those two laws of thermodynamics. Okay, the first law is going to be concerning the principle of conservation of energy. Well, what exactly does that mean? That means that the energy of the universe is constant, okay? Remember how we saw the energy from the sun come down and onto the producers, and then the producers transferred it to the consumers. So the energy can be transferred and transformed energy. The only thing it cannot be is it can never be created or destroyed. This would be the first law of thermodynamics. Now the second law of thermodynamics is talking about energy transfer as well. Energy transfer or transformation increases the entropy or the disorder or chaos of the universe. So in other words, as energy is getting transferred, let's say right here we have this consumer actually eating this prey right here. So what's getting transferred is it's eating their food, the food that it contains, all the glucose molecules, all the proteins, all that. It's eating it, and then basically you're transferring that energy. Because remember, this deer at one point ate the grass, which had the sunlight energy. Okay, so it's basically a transfer of energy, and as it's getting transferred, remember, it's going to basically increase the entropy of the universe. Also, right here, this cheetah is actually chasing something, and in doing so, while it's running, it's actually releasing heat energy. So there's always going to be a little bit of heat lost with energy transfer. Okay. Also, right here, it is perspiring, so it's kind of sweating. So that's why you see water droplets coming off right here. So all in all, second law of thermodynamics is every energy transfer increases the disorder of the universe and also loses some heat energy. So once again, let's go ahead and recap that energy cycle. Remember, all energy is going to start with the sun. The sun's going to release that energy onto the plants so they can undergo photosynthesis. Then those plants are actually making glucose and oxygen for us to consume. So the glucose is what we use to consume for energy. And here's the oxygen. So we consume the glucose, which is basically a monosaccharide. It's a very the smallest of all of the carbohydrates. So we consume glucose and then we undergo cellular respiration. So what that means is that we're actually going to break down that glucose so that our bodies can release ATP, which is the energy source of our cells. Okay. Then our waste products from cellular respiration, this chemical reaction is we release carbon dioxide, which you breathe out, and we release also water. Okay. And then the carbon dioxide actually goes right back into photosynthesis, so it can continue to go on and on. And like this penguin says, it's the great circle of life. Okay. So now we're going to go ahead and do some definitions so we understand every single part of these chemical reactions that we're referring to. So a reaction, like the one you see right here, okay, is a chemical change that occurs when atoms, ions, or molecules interact. So in this case, we have these hydrogen and these oxygen molecules reacting and becoming a water molecule. Okay, a reactant are the molecules, atoms, or ions that enter a reaction at the beginning. So this would be our beginning two reactants, our hydrogen and our oxygen. Okay, and our product would be the remaining ones at the end of a reaction. So here's our water molecules, our two water molecules that were formed. Okay, this is a good time to recap on catabolic and anabolic. Okay, so remember, catabolic, we're tearing a larger molecule apart and breaking it down into smaller ones. Okay, does that look like that's what happened here? No, it's going to be anabolic reaction right here because we had two smaller molecules right here that actually underwent a chemical reaction. And that would mean that there had to be an added energy here. And in doing so, we got the result of a much larger molecule, which is the two water molecules. So when we're talking about these chemical equations occurring, how can we measure how much free energy is a result of that reaction occurring? Okay, that's what we call the delta G, or the change of energy, change of free energy. That's what this symbol stands for right here, the change of free energy. Okay, it's going to measure the energy that can do work when the temperature and pressure are uniform. Also, free energy is the measure of the stability of a system. Okay, so entropy is going to be always spontaneous, and it's a quantity used to measure how random a system is, or how random anything is. Obviously, a liquid would have a lot more entropy than a solid, okay, because these molecules are able to move around. Okay, it's the more random a collection of matter, the greater the entropy. So liquid would be have a lot more entropy than solid, and then gases would have a lot more entropy than even a solid or a liquid as well. Okay, and how can we tell if a reaction will occur spontaneously or not? So there's an equation to actually figure that out. Remember, delta G is the change in that free energy, or the change in the amount of energy to do work. Okay, delta H is the change in the system's enthalpy. Okay, a system's enthalpy, or enthalpy right here, that actually means the total energy in a system. So you do want to know that definition. What is the definition of enthalpy? It's the total energy in a system. Okay, so the next one is going to be, when you see the T in the equation, you're going to see absolute temperature in Kelvin units. This is not in Celsius, this is in Kelvin. How would I even, go about finding what Kelvin is, or how would I convert it? So Kelvin is the temperature in Celsius, and then add 273 to that. That would be your Kelvin temperature. Okay. Then the delta S is the change in the system's entropy. So the change in the system's chaos or disorder. And the total equation that you would now use, since you know what each of these mean, to find out if there's a positive change in energy or a negative change in energy, is this one down here. This is delta G is equal to delta H minus T delta S. So let's go ahead and say that in word form. So the change in free energy is equal to the change in the system's enthalpy, aka total energy, minus the temperature in Kelvin cycle multiplied by the change in the system's entropy. Okay? So, why do we even care again about delta G, delta S, all that stuff? Because we have to be able to tell if a chemical reaction is actually, like I said, adding energy to the system or releasing energy. So, because when we're talking about chemical bonds, okay, remember when they get broken apart, they release energy. When they're getting basically put together to make them larger, they're getting basically an added energy. So here is two terms you will have to know for the exam. Endergonic, okay, is energy in. In other words, you have to put energy into the system for it to occur. Okay, it does not happen spontaneously. And at the end of a reaction, if you calculate it out using that equation we just showed the last slide, you would end up with a positive delta G, or positive change in free energy. And I'll show you on a graph in just a second what that looks like. Okay. So the top graph right here you're seeing is actually an endergonic reaction. Basically, there's an input in energy. Okay. So what you're seeing right here is here's your reactant. So here's what you started off with at the very beginning. Remember, like for example, with the last slide, we had hydrogen and we had oxygen molecules. Okay. Then there had to have been an input of energy here, and that resulted in our product having a higher delta G or free energy than our reactant. So there had to have been an input of energy here. Okay, so whenever your reactant is lower and your product is higher, because right here, this is actually showing you free energy on the side, okay, and it's increasing as it's going higher, okay. So we have a positive delta G, or a positive increase in energy in the resulting product right here, okay. The opposite goes for exergonic. Exergonic, I think of exit. There has to be energy that's exiting the system or it's getting released. So it'd be like if we start off with our water molecules up here, okay, we have to have our activation energy starts us off, and at the very end of this chemical reaction, our products contain much less free energy than our reactant started with. So let's say we had water that became, and we kind of basically broke that bond of the oxygen hydrogens, and then we resulted in our two molecules have been broken apart. That means there's been a negative change in free energy, okay? Because energy got released out into the system. So all in all, there's been a change in the energy, okay? There's been a decrease in the product energy, and that results in our negative delta G, or negative free energy available. So here's also showing you right here, a nice little diagram. So energy in, okay, right here you can see energy going in. Here's your smaller molecules. Energy comes in and basically makes them into much larger organic molecules. Okay, they build compounds up. Opposite though, energy out, or an exergonic reaction, you have the larger molecules at the beginning of the reaction, and then there's a loss of energy out, and the breaking of those larger molecules into smaller molecules. That's what's breaking those compounds. That's an exergonic reaction. So let's look at an example of each of these with the actual chemical reaction written out. A good catabolic reaction to look at would be cellular respiration. So here's their glucose molecules. So let's say you eat a hot dog today. Let's pretend this is the glucose coming from the actual bread of the hot dog bun. Okay, so here's your glucose that you just ate. Here's the oxygen that you breathe every day, every minute, every second. And the reaction that's occurring in your cells is that it's actually breaking down this much larger glucose molecule into smaller molecules, which is our carbon dioxide, our water, and most importantly, our ATP, or energy for our cell. So this actually results in a negative 686 kilocalories per mole. Basically, you see that negative right here? You know it's a catabolic reaction or exergonic reaction. There's been a release of energy. Remember, it exited. So does this happen spontaneously or non-spontaneously? Okay. Remember, if it's being broken apart and there's a loss of energy, it can happen. It does happen spontaneously. Okay. Unlike anabolic, which you have to add energy, you have to take those anabolic steroids. Remember, anabolic is going to be also an endergonic. They both are going to require the input of energy. So let's look at them on a graph right here. So exergonic versus endergonic. Remember, a release of energy is exergonic, and then an input of energy is going to be our endergonic. Endergonic, our product has a much higher free energy than our reactants did, so our delta G is going to be greater than 0. On the other hand, though, right here, we actually have a loss of energy because those bonds have been broken apart in a catabolic reaction. So therefore, our products have much less energy than our reactants did because of that loss of energy. Energy has been released. This happens spontaneously. This does not happen spontaneously. And the last thing we're going to go over for this lecture is another example, but we just saw a really good example of catabolic reaction, and that was through the cellular respiration. Now let's go ahead and look at an example of anabolic pathway. So anabolic pathway, a good example would be photosynthesis, because we're actually going from two smaller molecules, carbon dioxide and water, and we are, remember, anabolic, it has to have an input of energy. It does not happen spontaneously, okay? So anabolic reaction is having this light energy from the sun come in, okay? And this is just showing where it occurs. It's occurring in the chlorophyll. So we have the light energy input right here, and that is actually building up a much larger molecule. That's what anabolic pathway is. So we're building up this much larger molecule, which is glucose. And of course, oxygen and water are also products of this reaction. So all in all, we result in a much greater product of free energy than we did have in our reactants. That's why we have a positive delta G, or positive free energy, which is 686 kilocalories per mole. Is this process spontaneous or non-spontaneous? Remember, it's not spontaneous because we are having this light energy coming from the sun right here. So if it's not spontaneous, would you consider that exergonic or endergonic? Okay, input of energy, it's an endergonic reaction. So in this lecture, we have actually already explained the two metabolic pathways. We talked about catabolic reactions, which is the breakdown of a larger molecule into smaller molecules, and then it in result releases energy, and anabolic pathways, which is smaller molecules being built up with an input of energy into much larger molecules. Okay. We also defined energy in the form of kinetic or movement energy and potential or stored energy. We discussed free energy in an endergonic and exergonic reaction. Free energy in an endergonic reaction is going to result in a positive delta G. An exergonic reaction will have a negative delta G because it's releasing energy. We discussed entropy, or disorder of a system. We explained the first law of thermodynamics, which is that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, and that's a summary of it. And then the second law states that energy will get transformed or transferred from one form to another and will always result in some sort of heat loss in that energy transfer.